Okay, g'day everyone at Wellington High School. Welcome to a brief video, just a quick one today, which is going to serve a couple of purposes. One is it's a refresher. So it's a bit of a reminder of the key principles that sit behind practicing restoratively for people that I've already met at the school and already done some training and some at the coalface work with. The thing about, I guess, when you look to refresh on something like this is that I hope that it causes you a couple of little aha moments, a couple of moments where you go, yeah, that's why I've missed this opportunity. I've forgotten that fundamental principle that sits behind practicing restoratively. And I guess the reason that you might want to revisit this from time to time is that when you start to get those principles in place and when they're there and when they're the filters that you view your work through, you start to see better opportunities through those filters. So for instance, one of the key principles that sits behind working restoratively is to remove power. It feels to me when I'm working with a particularly challenging class, and let's just say, I don't know, we've got year 8, because they can be good fun. It feels to me that the more I strain to be powerful in that environment, the more I try to force them to be educated, the more I try and do education to them, the harder my job becomes. But boy, there's a temptation for me to do that. So what I need to do in my lesson design, and then also in my pedagogy, in my practice, is to get into the classroom and say, I'm going to remove the power, and instead of doing education to them, I'm going to do it with them. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you might reflect on that today. And like I said, what I find is that when I remind myself of those principles, I stop thinking about what's the granular little strategy I need to try next. And I say, change your angle. Instead of trying to force this upon them, try and position myself as working with them. And what do you know, my work anyway becomes a lot easier when I start to take that view. So a reminder of some of those really key principles. And then for the people who are new to the school, this is a really fundamental approach and a really strong ethical underpinning of what the school's trying to build in terms of culture. So your role in that and understanding that is just fundamental. It's something that we need your participation in from the very first moment you walk into the classroom, because what we know about the culture of a school is that it's led by every single adult that's there. So it's a flattening, if you will, of responsibility. So when it comes to say what subjects we're going to offer or what programs we're going to run in the school, the leadership, the executive of the school has a really important role to play, because let's be really honest, they decide it and it happens. But when it comes to culture, we lead it collectively. So we need you to step into this notion of practicing restoratively really quickly, and we need you to, I guess, understand that as you move forward. So that's what this video is for, is to help you understand it. In fact, I start with this title slide mainly because this is my favourite picture when it comes to restorative practices, which sounds odd because there are no students in this picture. This is a group of Italian teachers. And what I love about this picture is, first of all, that they're positioned in a circle. So you can tell, well, one of the things that does is it emphasises what I was talking about before, that that there's an absence of power here. In fact, when you look at the picture, it's kind of hard to tell who the leader is. There's one person talking, but I'm not utterly convinced that he's in charge here, because it very much looks like we're working together. I think that what this picture also reminds me of is that there's no table, which tells us that the dialogue is actually the product here, not the thing that we're trying to nut out on a table so that we can walk away with a paper artifact of what we've done. In fact, one of the commitments that your school has made is to try and increase the depth and the frequency of professional dialogue that you get stuck in as educators, because we think that's where we make sense of things. And the other thing that I notice about this is just some nice comfy chairs, because what we want to do is to, sometimes just relax, sometimes let the foot off the pedal and just talk in real comfort, so that our creative brains can be engaged and we can do some really cool stuff. So that's me framing up, I guess, what this video is all about today. But it's really about, like I mentioned before, is about understanding what restorative practices is trying to achieve for your school, where it comes from, and how it is that you can get started with it in your practice. So let's get clear about why restorative practices. What we're saying here is what we want to build is an explicit practice framework. So what we mean about being explicit is having a plan. So instead of saying, you know what, let's take some people who are qualified at university and perhaps have some experience working in the classroom, and let's go and put them into classrooms and just trust that their relationship building skills and techniques will be consistent, and hope for the best, instead of saying that, because what we get from that is inconsistency of practice. Now, that's not necessarily inconsistency of bad practice. It just means that we've got people who are really good people and qualified people who are off there trying to do the best they can with what they've got. And the kids tend to bump from person to person trying to work out what the rules are. So you end up with a large cohort of students in your school, when this is the case, when there's no plan. You end up with a large cohort of students in your school who are kind of testing the boundaries all the time. Now, when I ask people, do you have any boundary testers in your classrooms? Most people grin and can sort of very quickly, pull up the names or the faces of several students who test boundaries. And so what this highlights for us is, number one, how important consistency is. But we're looking for consistency of process here, not consistency of outcome, if that makes sense. So it's not about saying that when you work restoratively that if a kid pushes someone, that's a level C behaviour, therefore we apply this consequence every single time, because there's degrees of pushing, isn't there? There's the little nudge you give your friend when they've done something really cool with a grin, and then there's the full scale shove that could actually cause permanent injury. And when we try to get consistent about outcome and try to make it really formal like that, we encourage inconsistency in the way that we deal with things. So for all our effort, we get nowhere, and that's why I'm often telling people that when it comes to consistency, we know it's important, but the hardest way, the worst way to try and achieve consistency is to try. Because unfortunately our emotions and the variables within behaviour will always pull us towards inconsistency. You'll be engaging with this video at a different level at minute 3 than you will at minute 55. You'll engage differently on a Monday than you do on a Friday, on a hot day than you do on a cold day, in the morning than the afternoon in February compared to November. We are always at the whim of our emotions and at the whim of circumstances, and you could not have picked a circumstance to work in that's more variable than a school. Let's be really honest, hundreds of young people whose brains aren't finished yet, raging hormones and connections with the people who have the most irrational emotional connection to them, that's their parents. So we're saying that just trying in that environment is unlikely to work. So let's get a plan in place. Let's get explicit. And what we say about the Restorative Practices framework is that it enables us to build that explicit practice framework. We get really clear about how it is we're working, and we say we're starting from this building block of saying what we need to do is to build healthy relationships. And for most people that sits neatly with their purpose for being an educator. And for most educators, have worked out pretty quickly that if you want to be effective in helping your kids learn, you have to leverage a strong relationship. And as a result, what we think that we're going to get is stronger school communities. And I would actually contend to you that too many schools sort of go the wrong way, formally again, on trying to build community. We think we build community by having a community event. There's a nice formal thing that we can arrange. Or we think that what we need to do is to run parent-teacher interviews because we can then book them, we can get them, and we can tick it off and we can say we got it done. But I don't know about you, but if I was to define what community is, I think that it's just a big bundle of helter-skelter relationships. It's just a community for me is just a collective noun for relationships. And what we want to do is say, let's build healthy relationships, and if we can have more healthy than unhealthy relationships, then we're likely to get the level of school community that we're aiming for. And that's what this plan's all about. So let me reveal to you what our 3-year journey is all about in terms of how we're going to learn what that plan is. So this is the one plan on a page for a 3-year journey for your entire school. We're going to touch on the very first component of it today, which is the restorative framework. And that's about looking at the continuum and looking at what it takes to be able to I guess, operate with consistency right up and down from the informal, the little things that happen hundreds of times every day, all the way through to the formal things that are going to make a difference, because we need to be consistent there to discourage the boundary testing. And the operating domains. And the operating domains is pretty much just a model that you reflect on. It's just a window through which to view your practice. And it's not a window of judgment. And I want you to remember that really clearly when we get to it. It's an opportunity for you to be able to say, okay, I need to make an adjustment here, an adjustment there to get the result that I'm looking for. It's not about saying I suck or I'm ugly or I'm terrible or it's not about saying I'm fantastic and wonderful and I need no improvement. So if you think about the way that you reflect when you reflect in the morning, when you're getting ready to go to work, you might put on a little makeup or do your hair or shave, as the case may be, or all of them, I wouldn't know. And what all of us do is we make little adjustments. We look at we look at ourselves in a mirror. We say, a little bit more there, a little bit less here, and I'll get the result that I'm looking for. And that's what reflection's all about. So that's how we're going to use those operating domains. Really simple they are. When we're moving forward in our practice, and we'll hear us talk more about this as we go through our partnership, we'll get into the notion of how you build a fair process. There are 3 E's that sit behind that, so they're nice and easy to remember. There's the first one's engagement, which means basically what we do with restorative practices is, even if there's a relational problem between, say, you and a student or between 2 students in your classroom, is that we try to engage, particularly somebody who we might view as being a perpetrator. We try and engage the perpetrator first. So we know that if there's a relational problem and half of the people clock out with a snarl of, don't worry about it, give me your attention, I don't give a stuff, we know that the relationship is unlikely to be fixed. So we need to get them engaged. The second principle is explanation, and the third one is expectation clarity. And if we can get that happening, then we find that we get a lot less of people saying, that's not fair, which can be something that teachers can sometimes hear a lot, to the point where it feels like fingernails down a chalkboard. And we want to eliminate that unfairness. And what we know about people as quite an intrinsically built-in function that we have is that we will actually cop an unfair outcome if it's felt that we got there a fair way. If we feel that the outcome is unfair and it was decided arbitrarily without me being involved, then I'm not going to learn from it. I'm going to plot revenge, and I'm going to take umbrage against the people who administered that outcome to me. So really important we get clear about fairness. We also want to get clear about the function of the restorative questions. Now, you've got in your school, if you go and talk to Jodie, she's got some cards there that she can hand out to you with these restorative questions, but there's a trap involved in that, and that is that people think that they are a script, and they're not. The questions for working restoratively are just a guide. They're there to help you through a very simple process, which is to go past, present, future. I think if you're just starting the process here of working restoratively, what you'll note is that we quite often, if something's going to get anchored when we're working with students in conflict, it'll get anchored in the past. They'll be going back, and he did this to me 5 years ago, and that's only because you did this to me 6 years ago. And we find ourselves getting further and further from a resolution that's future-oriented because we're just so deep in the past. So restorative practices, questions, when you see them, you'll note that they're designed to go past, present, future. But if you work with the students and just go, hey, what was that all about? How do you reckon that's making people feel? And what are you prepared to do so people don't feel that way anymore? Then I reckon you've kind of gone past, present, future. And so I would always say that you are a restorative practitioner if you did that, and even if you didn't ask any of the questions on the cards. So they're there as a backup. They're there as a backup to help you through that process. And then the fourth thing we're really going to need to get clear about is the theory and the research here. Now, the theory, I do want to unpack the theory with you here a little bit today, because it's about moving from what we call an adversarial model to a restorative model. Which is hard, and that's why it's going to take us 3 years. It's hard because to ask people to change their model is effectively asking people to change their mind. And so it's easy sometimes to change some of your words. You can change some of your practice. You can even change some of your thinking. But to change your mind, that's a big deal. To actually go from a mindset around the adversarial approach. And it's hard to do that because most of us went to school with that. So we've pinned some value to that along the way. it's hard for us to take those goggles off and to put our restorative goggles on. So I'm here to support you with that. And I hope that one of the things you know is that when you get to the end of this video, even today, there'll be an email address that I'll point you to and some resources that you can use to be supported in that, because we really want you to know that, that you deserve support to change your mind in that way. And I guess the research here, the thing I love about restorative practices is that it's, if you can follow me here, it's not a hypothetical construct. So it's not a bunch of people sitting around in a boardroom somewhere who decided, well, the schools seem to have a problem with respect. Let's build a program and some CDs and some posters and let's flog it to them and see if they gobble it up. This is built not on a marketing premise, but it's built on a really deep body of research around human emotion, and in particular the emotion of shame. Why is that pertinent in a school? Some of the studies that we've looked at that we think are really important, around one of them actually revealed the other day that I was reading, was that 80% of student poor behaviour choices in a classroom could be directly attributable to the presence of the feeling of academic failure. So when people feel that the classroom's a place that they're probably going to fail and probably going to stuff up, they wreck it, they behave poorly, and it's because of the shame they experience. So what we want as educators is to say, can we get our heads around this? Can we get into this notion of shame, get it, and see when it's a shame response that we're dealing with, and then be able to either circumvent the damage that can be caused by that, or even prevent it in the first place. So that's what we're on about. That's what we're trying to do over 3 years. It's pretty big, but we're gonna work really hard on it together in a multitude of different ways. So the aim of any relational practice, if we're getting a bit clear about relationships, what we're saying is that we're going to encourage the use of restorative approaches when we get inevitable conflict and tension. Because we're several hundred young people, brains not finished, lots of emotions, lots of hormones, we're stuffed. So when it comes, and look, I say we're stuffed, but the truth is, in any highly functional relationship, there's an element of conflict. So even in the very best marriages, even in the best relationships in households, even in the best friendships, there's a little bit of conflict and tension. We're not aiming at getting rid of conflict and tension. We're aiming at having a way to deal with it when it comes. And our way of dealing with it is to say that we're going to focus on repairing harm and strengthening relationships. So when we're saying that we know that the conflict will come. When it does, let's say, all right, what's the damage? What's the harm? And then in terms of people, in terms of the way that people connect, what needs to be done to fix that? How could we repair that? This is where the notion of restoring comes along. So we're saying that instead of being disposable, and boy, we're disposable these days, aren't we, as human beings? That there's certain jobs that have died completely because of how disposable we are. There's certainly not many TV repairmen getting around these days, are there? Because most of the time, if the TV breaks, we chuck it out and we get another one now. We want to teach our kids that being disposable about relationships ain't such a good idea. So what we want to do is teach them to restore, to repair the relationship, rather than throw it out. And if you think about what your kids are exposed to, even social media kind of teaches them that if someone does something that you don't like or is a bit embarrassing or a bit cringeworthy, I'm told that the right word for that these days is cringy, not cringeworthy. They're by the teenagers that live in my house. That if they do that, the right thing to do is to unfriend them with just a click of a button. We'd like them to learn the skills and to embed in their lives the capacity to be able to build and then sustain those relationships. So the basic tenets of RP being harm and relationships, what we say then is, well, how has that played out in the past? And this is this adversarial or blame-based approach that most of us went to school with, which is to say that, excuse me, just a quick sip of water, which is to say that what we usually do if there's conflict or tension is we ask what happened, who's to blame, and what punishment or sanction is needed. And usually we end up with some sort of, I know myself when I've dealt with conflict this way in the past, I've ended up with a little bit of even like a blame quotient going on in my head. I've had, that it's probably 80% your fault and 20% your fault. And I'll ask witnesses and it starts to become this massive investigation and you feel like you've launched educational CSI and you've got your detective hat on and it just takes forever and ever. And eventually all you need to do with that 80-20 split in your head, however it's ended up, is make a decision about the punishment or sanction. So it might be that one student who's been doing it repeatedly You get sick of it, and we say that's enough. You're going to have a couple of detentions, and I'll be calling a parent down for a meeting, and another kid might get a warning. Just for the little bit of sort of poking the bear that they'd been doing before the incident. The issue that we have with that is that what we're trying through our intervention, our lengthy past-based intervention here, we're trying to intervene and deter the behaviour from happening again. The problem with that is that when it comes to human behaviour, about the only thing we know for absolute certain is that no behaviour changes randomly. Behaviour, and I often make the joke and did with the staff when I met them the first time, that I can prove that theory, that behaviour doesn't change randomly, and that is because nobody accidentally woke up this morning on a diet. You just wouldn't wake up and accidentally eat half a grapefruit, because they're quite disgusting. And so what I know is that it's the thinking that drives the behavioural change. You have to think about it first before you eat half a grapefruit. You have to use a little bit of delayed gratification. You have to say, well, I can eat this now because I'll feel better when I step on the scales later on. And if that stands to reason with you, that thinking drives behaviour, then it should also stand to reason that negative thinking drives negative behaviour, and that positive thinking is more likely to drive positive behaviour. So what we know, for instance, then if with two students who I might have said, okay, you're getting 2 detentions and I'm calling a parent, is that while they sit in that detention, if we really ask ourselves what they're thinking, it's unlikely to be, wow, I've really disappointed other people and let myself down, and I really need to use this time to plan productively for a better future. They don't do it. They sit there, they plot revenge, they blame other people, and they come out more likely to do something negative, which means that we get this cycle, this revolving door mentality around detention, where the same kids just keep filing through. And the kids that get the warning tend to often rub it in their noses, making the shame even worse. So at some point, and this is where Wellington High School really impresses me, at some point you've got to say, do we keep straining at this flawed system and try to do it better, try to scoop up more kids, try to punish more effectively, or do we say that it's time for a new system? And I would contend that it's time for a new one. So the one that we're saying is, let's move on from that and let's start to use this restorative approach, which is about saying what happened. Sure, but what I want you to do this time is, instead of launch major investigations and royal commissions into what's gone on, I want you to seek a very technical term for how much of the past you need. It's a gist. I need you to get a gist. Get a bit of a rough idea of what happened and say, okay, even if you can summarise it after about 30 seconds of ranting, if you can, and just say, okay, so I get it, that it seems there were some pretty nasty words said at lunchtime today, and actually it got right onto the border of being a bit physical as well. I get it. Thank you very much for filling me in. Then we move on quickly and we say, what's the harm that's resulted? How's this made you feel? What's the issue for you? What's the hardest part about this for you? And what about for you? Okay, and then what do we need? What needs to happen from here to fix that up? What's the action that you need to take? What's the apology of action? I've even got a class, a school that I work with, that has eliminated the word sorry, because I bet you might have felt that, and I'll talk to that in just a minute, that we're leading now to the fake sorry that teenagers are just so good at delivering. And so what we need to do is to avoid that, and they've gotten rid of the word sorry in preference for the word shorry, because in their school they show that they are sorry, and that's why they've combined that into shorry. And they even have a list developed up on the wall of ways that you can demonstrate that you are sorry, and they go all the way through to a teacher that I work with who said that the two kids actually have agreed to connect on Fortnite that evening and talk while they play together for an hour, and that'll mend the relationship. And what do you know? It's as weird and creative and out there as it is, but it happened, and it's certainly more effective for those students than the fake sorry that's just been parroted out in front of someone for no reason. So the key differences between old approach, adversarial approach, and the new approach, the restorative approach, that when you're adversarial, the focus is deeply in the past. The preoccupation is with who's to blame, what's my blame split like, and deterrence is linked to the notion that I've got to get the punishment right. So I've got to get the punishment either consistent, or I've got to make it severe enough that they won't do it again. if that stood up as a behaviour management, behaviour change theory, then the most severe punishment for the most severe crime would be reducing the prevalence of the most severe crime. So the most severe punishment you can get is the death penalty, and therefore that should be reducing violent crime, say in the United States. We've got to ask ourselves how that's working for them. And the reason it's not working is because the punishment's not being used as a deterrent at all. It's being used as a preventer. So it's true, undoubtedly, that when you're dead, you commit no more violent crimes. But unless we are prepared to use that methodology to prevent, which means you are not going to let any students involved in any social interactions with any other students ever, then the crime and punishment way of working falls down. If we want to genuinely deter, we're going to have to try and do it through a different means than punishment. So the restorative method is about saying, let's go, instead of anchoring everything in the past and investigating things to within an inch of its life, let's quickly go from the past just to the present to the future. Let's be nimble about that. Let's emphasise the resulting harm rather than the blame. So stop and go, no, really, how's it making people feel? Because I don't reckon it was sad when you hit her in the head with a cricket bat. I reckon it was something else. So let's get them sophisticated around that. And then let's say that deterrence we think is linked to relationships, and being personally accountable to those. That we want them to have a moment where they go, wow, there'll be a lot to clean up here if I were to damage this relationship, because that's what we do as a matter of cultural norm at Wellington High School. You probably did feel that moment there where it felt like we were going to get to, what happened, how did you make them feel? Sad. What are you going to do to fix that? Say sorry. So I don't want you to think that there can't be punishment and consequences within a restorative model. In fact, there are two big myths around restorative practices. One is that it's too soft. I want to dispel that with you right now. And secondly is that it takes too long. I want to show you how you can be really nimble about practicing restoratively as we move forward. So punishment and consequences can exist, best existing with the students who we would refer to in the staff room as our frequent flyers. And the way that we have to use punishments is to make them meaningful and relevant. And the best way to do that is just negotiate them in advance. So I want to put that in place for you right now. Restorative practice is not about saying, right, I've had enough of this, I'm going to come up with a punishment now because this is getting out of control. Restorative practices is saying, I have spotted that this is getting out of control, that there's a pattern of repeat offence here. And what I'm going to do is sit down with you after you've cleaned up the mess with the people harmed and you've done your shorry. I'm going to sit down with you after and say, hey, this is happening a bit lately, isn't it? What do you think is going to happen if you were to demonstrate that behaviour again, say over the next 4 weeks? Okay, and we get agreement on that, and it often does end up something like, 2 detentions, and I'll be calling your parent down. We write it down on a piece of paper, we get agreement on it, we put both our signatures on it. And it means that if you do need to follow through on that, because let's be honest, there's a reasonable chance you will. It means that if you need to follow through, you don't do it in such a way that sacrifices your relationship with the kid, because you're just the person following through on their idea. So I really want you to just think hard about that. The consequences that come out of the blue, we often get really antsy and blameful about. So if you were to get a speeding fine in the mail and you go, oh no, I was 6 kilometres over in a 60 zone, that's no good. And then you folded the next part of the envelope open and found that the fine was $25,000, you'd really kick back about that. Because where'd that come from? You're going to say, stupid government, you're blaming people, ringing lawyers and going to fight. And that's what our students do when we deliver consequences out of nowhere. They fight back. We need to get them engaged in that process. So step in before or as soon as you see a behaviour pattern emerging, and that's how you can make consequences and punishment fit within the restorative model rather than flipping out of the restorative and over to the adversarial when it happens. I hope that makes sense. So let's talk about what you're going to do. So basically this is the restorative practices continuum where we move from informal to formal. And what we acknowledge in restorative practices is that we're going to move from informal where frequency is high. So this is for the stuff that happens every single day with outrageous regularity, the stuff that you have to deal with as a teacher, hundreds of times a day, all the way to the formal, which is when something really serious happens, and we've got to deal with it. So what's that all about? At the very informal end, where frequency is high, little things that happen with crazy regularity, we want you to use what's called an effective statement, which pretty much is just say what you're already going to say, but chuck in a feelings word. It's going to cost you a second or so because frequency is high, therefore your time investment needs to be low, needs to be crazy low. And what that means is instead of saying to a kid, hey, start your work, we're going to look over at the kid and say, hey, I'm frustrated with how long it's taking you to start your work. Get going. And you'll notice that it took me an extra second or so, but the word that you probably heard me say the loudest in that sentence was frustrated. And this is the limbic system, our brain operating for us, and this is how you teach big things like empathy. You don't learn empathy from somebody giving you an empathy PowerPoint on a Wednesday afternoon. You learn it by being exposed to a culture. And the best revealer of culture is its language, so that's why we have to make this language commitment in a restorative school. It's reminded through its language that your behaviour affects other people. That's what empathy is all about. So if we want to have empathic, caring students, and let's be honest, one of the challenges we have is that students these days can be more self-centred than ever before. We know the literature tells us that, less interested in others. And so if we're going to change that, we don't change it on a Wednesday afternoon. We change it by changing our language, because language is the greatest revealer and driver of culture. So we've got to start to use those effective statements. Get creative, have a bit of fun with it. I want you to have a competition with a colleague for how many effective statements you can get in there. Have a competition with a colleague about what's the weirdest effective statement that you've used lately. I've got one recently where two people were having an argument in the staff room, and I thought this was awesome, about who had the better effective word that they were using that week. One was flabbergasted and one was flummoxed, and I thought that's a great argument to have in a staff room. And what's interesting about it is that that's how you grow this, is you've got to have fun with it. You've got to muck around with your words and your language, because Rod and Jody and the leadership of the team can put in policy if they want that we use effective statements to deal with low-level behaviours in the school, but it won't change a thing. Putting it in policy will do nothing. It should be there because that's how we want to do it, but it won't actually change it until we as the practitioners begin to use it in our language. So set yourself a target. I want to know if you could get through 30? Do you think you could do 30 in a day? Maybe 50? Different times that you could actually use an effective statement to describe the way you're feeling positively and negatively. I've got a default positive, which is to tell people I'm impressed. I don't know why I use that word, but it just gets away on me, and I use it far too much. I find myself going, you've got to think of another word, and I should. And negatively, I use disappointed. I just find it has real impact to tell people that disappointed in your choice there, make another one. And I find that that's better than, hey, stop that, do this, because I'm inviting a fight with the second one. And when I use an effective statement, I invite an opportunity. So I find that works quite effectively for me to speak effectively. The next step along is what we call an effective interaction. And that means we're going to start to use that past, present, future methodology. So what we're saying is that we're going to go really quick fire. When a student, for instance, you might have hit them with 2 or 3 effective statements in the classroom, and you're thinking, boy, I'm frustrated that you haven't started your work. I'm annoyed you haven't started. Okay, now I'm getting really angry. And you're using them. They're not getting anywhere. What you do with an effective interaction is you pull them aside at the next little break you get. So that could be, just while the other students are working. It could be at recess. It might be come and see me at lunchtime. It could be just while they're walking out of the classroom at the end of the unit. Whatever it is, just seize your next little opportunity and say, hey, what was that all about? How do you reckon that made me feel when you did that? And what are you prepared to do about that the next time we're together? And what we know about that is that if we can get the students to answer those questions, they have to think about their behaviour. And that's the cool part about restorative practices, is that instead of us going on a rant and telling them what to do, because let's be honest, when we're ranting, when we're providing instruction behaviourally, they're not listening. They're in their head going blah, 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 and looking at each other and laughing. What we need to do is to get clear about the concept of asking questions, and then staring in silence. let them struggle with it, because they have to think about their behaviour just to answer it. If we can cajole them, if we can facilitate a conversation when they end up saying, "Yeah, okay, I'll get back to work," the chance of them following through on that is so much higher than if we told them to get back to work. So using effective interactions, this is where past, present, future comes in. Time investment, probably a minute or two. The first one will be a bit clunky because they'll try and resist a bit. They're not used to it. But once they become used to it, they really get in line, this is what he's up to here. And they know what the answers are to provide. And they know the kind of thing that we're looking for, because they start to, and they join in. They start to fill it. And we sometimes get a bit frustrated with that because we think, they're just saying the words. They just know the script. They just know the things they're supposed to say. But if they get back to work and it works, I'm all right with that. I'm good with them knowing what our practice is. It doesn't need to be a secret to them. And the next one I wanted to mention was just small impromptu conferences that come up for group situations. So I'm often talking about that. I often mention that I think every teacher has a superpower, and I think everyone has a kryptonite. And my superpower is angry boys. That works really neatly for me, and they don't elevate my heart rate and don't upset me, so I can cope with all that. But girls from about year 5 to year 9 really do my head in. They're my kryptonite, and so I need a plan for them. So what I did with group situations was to say I needed a past, present, future structure. Because what I found with the girls in particular was that they are so anchored in the past. They are kind of the world champions of anchoring the argument about what has happened in things that happened many, many years ago, let alone things that happened 2 days ago. I find that because they're so skilled in taking the conversation to the past, I needed a way to stop that from happening. So I actually commandeered a piece of whiteboard in my office for any group problems that came up. And they weren't always the girls, but there was a prevalence around that in my work anyway. And we just said, we had divided the box on the whiteboard into 3 sections. It was P3, P3, F3. And it just said that instead of me spending an hour listening to all the problems and helping them dig further into the past and thereby further from an opportunity to do something about it in the future, I said that I would give you 3 minutes for the present, 3 minutes for the past, 3 minutes for the present, and 3 minutes for the future. And that's all. And that was, I found, incredibly effective, because after 3 minutes of telling me what had happened, I cut them off and I refused fiercely to let them talk about the past any longer. They would try, but this was the only way that they could get my help, was if they were prepared to do it my way. And we would fill out that first box about P3, and then I would walk away from it, and then I would go, now we're going to move to the middle box, which is P3 for the present. Tell me how this is making people feel. And they would often tell me that they're sad and they're frustrated and they're annoyed and they're angry and depressed and anxious and all those words that we don't want people to feel when they're at school. And then after 3 minutes, I would stop them again and say, we're not talking about that any further. We've got a gist here of not only the past but also of the present. And now I would say to them, now girls, I want you to tell me what it is you're going to do about that in the future for 3 minutes. What will you do so that these feelings are no longer prevalent amongst the people in this room? And I'll say every sentence you start from here is going to start with, I am going to. Well, I would come up with, I am going to have lunch with her tomorrow. I am going to write her a note. I'm going to delete the nasty comment off Facebook. Whatever it is they're going to do, but they would be action oriented. I would often put one last action in there, which was that I was going to check in on them on Friday to see if this was all working, and then I would send them back to class. So instead of them taking up an hour of my time, I found that they were taking up 9 minutes, and I was actually being effective, because the truth is the first time that I was spending a huge chunk of time with those students, I was actually making the problem worse by encouraging them to dig up more and more things that they could use to blame each other for. So it helped me to get effective. And the great part of working this way, for me anyway, was that it's a methodology they can learn to use without me. So after I'd done it with the same group 2 or 3 times, I would often just say, they would come and, we've got a bit of a problem, Mr. Voigt, and I'd say, all right, no worries, and come in and sit down. There's the whiteboard, and they said they were waiting for me to start, and I'd go just hand the whiteboard marker to one of them and say, I'll be back in 9 minutes. because they can, once they learn the methodology, they can drop the context or the circumstance into that methodology and start to learn how to do it themselves, which is pretty cool. The last couple of things I wanted to mention just briefly before we talk about reflection are the large group stuff. So that's about circles. We've spoken about that briefly as a group. We'll do more of that in our training as we move forward. But also, if you want to look in the member section that you've got access to, I'll talk about that at the end of this video. If you want to look in that member section, you'll see that there's a webinar in there called Restorative Classrooms. They're called around restorative circles. And if you go and look at that webinar, it'll tell you everything that you need to know to get started with it. I use circles, not because people get the impression that sometimes it's this magical circle of trust or something like that, and it sounds a bit almost namby-pamby. It's not that. The reason that I use circles a lot is that I find it's the best physical manifestation of my intention to not be powerful in the classroom. There's no special spots in a circle, basically. So if we're all sitting in a circle, we're all working on one thing together, and I find that students actually mimic me more than resist me in that environment. And wherever possible, I use circles, often many times in the one lesson, not because I think that I'm doing the students an incredible favour. I do it because my instruction's easier when I work in a circle. So give that some thought and check out the further resources available to you on that. And then also there's formal conferencing. So that's that last step there, which is about saying that this is where we use the restorative questions as a script, because if we get something serious, something, for instance, suspendable, we want to have a way of re-entering that student into the environment where we've been really clear and really explicit about addressing the harm. We want them, when they come back to school, something's got to be different. Something's got to be different. We can't just have them sit at home for 2 weeks either playing on the Xbox or planning revenge and deciding whose fault everything is, and then come back into that environment and expect that the behaviour is going to be somehow improved. And that's what the formal conferencing allows us to do. So what you'll notice about the continuum is that, like I said, high frequency at the informal end, low frequency at the formal end, and time investment changes. So, 1 or 2 seconds for an effective statement, 1 or 2 minutes for an effective interaction, maybe 9 minutes for that small impromptu conference. Circles can go anywhere from about 30 seconds through to 15 minutes. And then the formal conferencing can sometimes take a couple of days to prepare for and about 45 minutes to actually administer. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal. But what this allows us to do is to say that no matter what the severity or the frequency, we're going to be consistent. This is how we tackle it in our school, which is pretty cool, I reckon. And the way we reflect is the last thing I want to talk to you about today. And it's really just understanding that, first of all, this whole notion of being firm and fair is something that tends to resonate quite well with teachers, because, most of us, if we were to look back on the teachers that had the greatest impact on us when we were at school, the most common thing that I hear from people is that they were really firm and fair. And they weren't one over the other. They didn't have one favourite out of firm and fair. They got the balance so right. Because firmness is about that, we can see their boundaries, limits and expectations. And fairness is about that support, encouragement and nurturing that we need to provide. And most of us would say all 6 of those things there, all 6 of those descriptors are actually positives, the things you want. So what we need to do is to say, how do we get them into our practice? And what we find ourselves saying is that when we get a bit too punitive, we get into we're big on the firmness, but we're not so great with the fairness. What happens is we position ourselves as an authority in the classroom, but we stigmatise, we apply labels. So we punish if you are late to class. So we might have a rule for our class that says, if you're late to class, then you will get a lunchtime detention. But what we might not be taking into account is there might be a student in your class who's basically the primary caregiver because of an alcoholic parent, or don't know, any sort of circumstance. They've got to get younger students up in the morning and get them off to their school, and then they try to get there. And if they walk into your class 30 seconds late, we haven't been particularly fair if we administer that punishment. So it's about the absence of understanding in the preference for being formal and rigid. And that student becomes the late student, or that student becomes the detained student, the one that's in detention all the time. And they live up to those negative labels, unfortunately. So we've got to be careful about being too box. The the not box tends to be the one that we don't. I mean, let's be really honest. It's a quadrant model, and any quadrant model, the bottom left quadrant is the one that sucks. So you wouldn't want to be in that one. But I do want to acknowledge, and I did this with the staff when we met the first time. We all go there. We all do. We just got to forgive ourselves and try to spend as little time there as possible. Now, I often say that it's the Friday afternoon right at the end of term when you're completely knackered and you go to class and you just don't get through the content that you were going to when you play an extra video. Yeah, I get it. I know why that happens, because you get tired and so does everybody else. You get a bit passive, a bit neglectful of your responsibilities, and we're not doing much at all. So my only encouragement to you here is to know when that comes along. Don't justify it, and don't stay in that state for very long. Take the deep breath you need. Fine, if you need the last lesson on a Friday at the end of term, if you need that lesson to get through, then okay. But don't make that the start of your lesson next term as well. We say that we're probably doing things for the students too much when we're too much on the fairness, but there's not enough expectation. There's not enough firmness in what we're expecting of them. So we get a bit permissive, a bit slack, if we're really honest. And that sounds like a bad place to be, but I also want to be acknowledging for you that the students who want you in the 4 box tend to, oh man, they're good at getting you there. So they tend to do things like, parade the excuses out. So they'll say, this is too hard, or I'm tired, or I don't get this is stupid, what do I have to do this for? I did this last year, this is dumb, you didn't explain it properly, you suck as a teacher. And they're hoping that if we can just, that if they sort of reach up and grab those expectations and pull them down, that you might drop them, and you might say, oh fine, just get the first 2 done, okay, and I'll let you go to recess. And they use that as a strategy for life. They're just wandering around trying to get people to drop expectations on them. So we've got to be careful about doing that for them. But there are times, of course, when you do need to go to any of these boxes. You may need to go to the 2 box if things are unsafe. If someone's about to hit someone with a chair, it's not the time to talk about their feelings. It's time to say we're going to step in here and we're going to survive this moment. Later on, we'll bring the fairness back in. But for now, we're on being firm. And just the same with fairness. Sometimes if you might have a student who has had a death in their family and they come into school in a terrible state, and we need to love them. We need to support them, we need to look after them, we need to do what we can for them, with a view that we're going to scaffold our way back to the with box. The with box is when we're relational, we're authoritative, we're not authoritarian, so notice the difference there, the distinction. And when we're authoritarian, we take authority through power. When we're authoritative, we assume authority through practice because of the way we conduct ourselves. And that means that we create these respectful environments. And respect is very much, don't fall for the trap of thinking that respect belongs in the 4 box. We respect people who have high expectations of us and who support us like crazy to reach those expectations. So know that that's what this is all about. And it's really about saying, where do you practice? What's your code? So when I talk about your code, what I mean is that if I were to give you 20 points to describe yourself as a practitioner, where would you put them in these 4 boxes? And the one that I often say is that I would put 11 of them in the with box. I reckon more than half the time I can get there. I would put 5 of them in the 2 box, because if I fall out of the with box, it tends to be to the 2 box and I get a bit angry and grumpy and start throwing out punishments. I need to catch myself doing that. I put 1 in the not box because I don't go there very often, but I do have Friday afternoon in the end of term as well. And I put 3 in the 4 box because on some occasions I can fall for that trap. So I want you to have a bit of a think at the end of this video today, and perhaps it's your homework, it's your price for your exit ticket out of the room wherever you're watching today, is to either on your own just plot your 20 points. Where would you put them in these 4 boxes to describe yourself? Show it to a colleague and say, what do you reckon? And then say, what is it that I would need to do differently? What would I need to do to be able to put 1 more point in the with box? I want you to know that to bring this back to that notion of shame, that I feel 0 shame about the fact that I am not a 20-0-0-0 teacher. I am an 11-5-1-3. I feel no shame about it because it reminds me that reflection's not about shame. Reflection's about adjustment. it's about change. And when I think about how I've been today, where do I practice? I'm like, I've been a bit two box today. I probably need to handle those two situations differently, and then I could put one more point back in the with box. It's just about a quest for continuous improvement, and I'm happy to do that. Without beating myself up over it, without feeling that I need to be perfect. So really important to start to use this reflectively if you're going to be a genuine restorative practitioner. To finish off, I want to remind you that you do have resource available to support you. So if you head to the Real Schools website, you'll see that there's a member section. And if you click on the member login tab and use the login and password Wellington HS, you'll be able to get into all the resources that we've built that can support you on this journey. So there's webinars in there that you can watch. There'll be a little bit like an experience of the one that you've just this video that you've gotten through today. There's teacher practice articles that all have links to the AITSL standards in them as well. So you could go and have a look at which standards are being addressed and then go, not for me, close that one, and then download a different one and go and read those and discuss them with your colleagues. There's articles there for people who are in leadership, or perhaps even if you're thinking about leadership as part of your future, then you can go and look at those. There's 3 and 4 minute staff meeting conversation videos. There's ebooks. There's all sorts of stuff in there. And you'll be seeing them a lot across the journey that we're going to walk together at Wellington High School. So go and put your head in there and start to look for things that can support you in your important work. And like I mentioned before, I want you to know that this work that we're doing together is genuinely a partnership. So you'll note on the screen there that email address, info@realschools.com.au, and if you would, make a veil of it, use it. Drop us a line if you would say, that all sounds well and good, Adam, but how do I use effective statements with this kid? Then let's see if we can answer that question together. Let's work on that together. So you'll always get an answer if you send an email to that email address with any level of practice query that you've got, or if you'd like to know more about our partnership, or if you'd be pointed to some resources that might support you, then please feel free to get in touch with us and know that we're going to support you through this shift. I mentioned right at the start that this is a journey of 3 years. It does take time to not just change your words and not just change your practice, but to change your mind. And my guarantee to you is that if you'll step into it and be prepared to change your mind, then the payoff for you is going to be an increase in your effectiveness. You will feel that you get more done, and that you're more meaningful and productive as a teacher, and you'll feel less stressed. That's certainly been the experience for me as an educator and as a school leader. One of the payoffs for me of making that commitment to change my mind and to practice restoratively has been sleeping better at night. And I think that helps us be at our best in our work for our kids as well. So thank you very much for sitting through my speaking to you for some period of time now. I hope this video is useful to you, and I hope to hear from you all really soon, and to connect again in our partnership as we move forward. Okay, bye for now.